What if everything you were told about Eve was never the full story? What if she wasn't the one who ruined everything, but the first human who dared to understand? Imagine the scene for a moment, not as a distant myth, not as a story you heard 1,000 times, but as something real, something unfolding in silence, a place untouched by pain, untouched by doubt, untouched by fear, a garden where nothing is broken, nothing is missing. Everything exists in perfect balance, a place where existence itself feels effortless, where there is no need to question, no need to struggle, no need to choose. Everything simply is. And yet, right in the middle of that perfection, there is something that does not fit. Something that introduces tension into a world without tension. A single tree. Not just any tree, but the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And the question begins right there. Why does it exist at all? Why would a perfect creation include something forbidden? Why would a God who knows everything place something in plain sight that is not meant to be touched? Why not hide it? Why not remove it completely? Why allow the possibility in the first place? And this is where the story becomes deeper than most people ever consider. Because a rule without the possibility to break it is not truly a rule. It is control. And obedience without choice is not obedience, it is programming. So the presence of that tree changes everything, because it introduces something new into a perfect world. The possibility of decision, and where there is decision, there is freedom, and where there is freedom, there is risk. And right there in that quiet, untouched space, something begins to move. Not loudly, not violently, but subtly. Voice appears, not commanding, not forcing, but questioning. The serpent, and the first thing it does is not to tell, but to ask, did God really say? And that question is more powerful than it seems, because it is not just about the command, it is about perception, it is about interpretation, it is about planting the first seed of doubt. And this is the moment where everything shifts, because for the first time, a human is not just hearing, but thinking. And who responds? Not Adam, but Eve. And that detail is often ignored. But it changes everything, because she is the one who engages. She is the one who processes the question. She is the one who steps into that space between certainty and curiosity. And the question is, why her? Why is she the one who answers? Why is she the one who allows the conversation to continue? Was it weakness? Or was it awareness? Was it temptation? Or was it the beginning of consciousness? Because the serpent does not simply say, eat. It introduces an idea, you will be like God, knowing good and evil. And that word, knowing, is the center of everything. Destroying, rebelling, but knowing, understanding, perceiving. And suddenly, the situation is no longer just about obedience. It becomes about awareness, about the difference between existing and understanding existence. And Eve looks at the tree, and for the first time, the text reveals her internal process. She sees that the fruit is good, that it is pleasing, that it is desirable for gaining wisdom. And this detail is crucial, because it shows that this is not an impulsive act. It is a considered one, is a moment of reflection, of evaluation, desire for something beyond what is given. And maybe that is what makes this moment so significant, because it marks the transition from passive being to active choice. And once that shift happens, nothing can ever be the same again, because choice creates identity, and identity creates responsibility. And in that moment, Eve makes a decision. She takes the fruit, she eats, and then she gives it to Adam, and he eats as well. And this part is often overlooked, because the focus is placed almost entirely on her. But he also chooses, he also acts, he also participates, and yet the narrative that follows tends to isolate her as the source of the problem. And that raises another question. Why? Why is she remembered as the one who caused everything, when both of them made the same decision? Is it because she was first? Or is it because she was the one who questioned, the one who thought, the one who stepped beyond what was simply accepted? And right after this moment, something immediate happens. Their eyes are opened. Not later, not gradually, but instantly. They see, they perceive, they become aware, and the first thing they notice is not the world, not God, but themselves, their own nakedness. And this detail is deeply symbolic, because awareness begins internally, before it expands outward. And with that awareness comes something new, something that did not exist before: shame. And this is the beginning of a new kind of existence, one that is no longer defined by innocence, but by consciousness. And when God comes into the garden, they hide something that never happened before, because now there is fear, now there is distance, now there is separation. And when God asks, "Where are you?" it is not a question of location, it is a question of state. It is an invitation to confront what has changed, and the response reveals something profound about human nature. Adam says, "The woman you gave me," shifting responsibility away from himself. And Eve says, "The serpent deceived me." And in that moment, a pattern begins that continues through all of human history: the tendency to pass blame, to avoid ownership, to look outward instead of inward. And yet, beneath all of this, the deeper question remains: what actually happened here? Was this simply disobedience, or was it transformation? Was it a fall, or was it a transition? Because before this moment, there was no growth, no development, no evolution of thought, only existence. But after this moment, everything changes. Because now, there is awareness. Now, there is the ability to distinguish. Now there is the beginning of a journey, and that journey includes pain, struggle, and consequence, but it also includes meaning, connection, and purpose. And maybe that is what makes this story so powerful, because it does not just describe an event, it describes the birth of human experience. And that raises a question that is impossible to ignore. If you had been there, in that same position, without knowing the outcome, without understanding the consequences, would you have chosen differently? Would you have ignored the possibility of knowing? Would you have remained in a state where everything is given, but nothing is understood? Or would you have reached for that same fruit, driven by the same curiosity, the same desire to see beyond what is visible? And maybe that is the point that most people miss, that this story is not just about what happened then. It is about what happens now, in every moment where you are faced with a decision, in every moment where you feel the tension between safety and truth, between comfort and understanding. Because the real question is not what Eve did. The real question is what you do when you are faced with your own version of that choice. When you are standing in front of something that challenges what you know, something that invites you to question, to think, to step beyond what is familiar. Do you stay where you are? Or do you move forward, knowing that it will change you, knowing that there is no way back to who you were before? And maybe that is the deeper meaning hidden within this ancient story, that becoming aware is not a mistake. It is a process, a necessary step in becoming fully human. And if that is true, then Eve was not simply the one who broke the system. She was the first to step into what it means to be human, the first to move from passive existence into conscious life. And that changes everything, because it shifts the narrative from blame to transformation, from error to awakening. And once you see it that way, you cannot unsee it, because the story stops being about the past and starts becoming a mirror reflecting something within you, something that asks, again and again, what will you choose when the moment comes? When the question appears, when the possibility stands in front of you, waiting, silent, just like that tree once stood in the middle of the garden. And if you keep following this thought just a little further, you begin to realize that this story was never meant to stay in the past. It was never meant to be locked inside an ancient text, because what happened in that moment continues to repeat itself in every human life, in every decision, in every doubt, in every moment where something inside you whispers that there might be more than what you have accepted so far. Because just like in that garden, the voice that changes everything rarely comes as an order, it comes as a question. Subtle, almost invisible, but impossible to ignore once it is heard. And that question begins to move through your thoughts, slowly at first, almost harmless. But then it grows, it expands, it challenges what you thought was certain. And suddenly, what once felt stable begins to feel fragile. What once felt clear becomes uncertain. And this is the exact moment where the real tension begins. Not outside, but inside. Because the greatest conflict in this story was never between God and humanity, it was within the human mind itself. Between what is known and what could be known. Between staying where it is safe and stepping into something unknown. And this is where the story becomes deeply personal. Because every person faces this moment, maybe not with the visible tree, maybe not with the serpent speaking directly, but with situations, ideas, realizations that force you to choose. And just like Eve, you do not always have all the answers, you do not always know the outcome. You only know that something is pulling you forward. Something is asking you to look deeper, to question, to understand. And the truth is, that pull can feel uncomfortable, even dangerous. Because understanding has consequences. Once you see something, you cannot unsee it. Once you realize something, you cannot return to the state you were in before. And that is exactly what happened in that moment. Because when their eyes were opened, it was not just about seeing differently, it was about becoming different. And this is a point that changes everything. Because it means that the event was not just external, it was internal. It was a transformation of perception, a shift in consciousness. And once that shift happens, reality itself changes. Not because the world has changed, but because the way it is experienced has changed. And that is something every human being eventually encounters. A moment where you realize that the way you have been seeing things is not complete, that there is more beneath the surface, and that realization can be unsettling, because it forces you to confront things you might have avoided, truths you might not have wanted to face. And this is where fear begins to appear, not as an enemy, but as a signal that something significant is happening, something that matters, something that has the potential to redefine who you are. And just like in the garden, the instinct is often to step back, to hide, to return to what feels safe. But once awareness is there, hiding does not remove it, it only delays what must eventually be faced. And this is why the moment when they hid from God is so important, because it reveals something deeply human, the desire to avoid confrontation with the consequences of awareness. But the question, "Where are you?" still echoes, not as a demand, but as a call to self-recognition, a call to step out of hiding and face what has changed. And this is something that continues to happen in every life, because at some point, you are confronted with the reality of your own choices, your own awareness, your own understanding, and in that moment, there are only two directions: to accept it or to deny it, to grow through it or to resist it. And the interesting thing is that growth is rarely comfortable. It often comes with struggle, with uncertainty, with moments where everything feels unstable. And yet, it is through that instability that something new is formed, something stronger, something more aware. And this is where the deeper meaning of this story begins to reveal itself. Because what looks like a fall from the outside might actually be the beginning of something from the inside. Because before that moment, there was no real understanding of good and evil, no real awareness of consequence, no real depth of experience. But after it, everything becomes more complex, more challenging, but also more meaningful. And this is where the narrative shifts, because it is no longer just about what was lost, it is also about what was gained, the ability to reflect, the ability to choose, the ability to grow. And these are not small things. They are the foundation of everything that makes human life what it is. And this is why the question of whether Eve was right or wrong becomes more complicated than it seems. Because if her action led to the awakening of human consciousness, then it cannot be reduced to a simple mistake. It becomes part of a process, a necessary step in something much larger. And this does not remove the consequences. It does not deny the difficulty that follows, but it adds another layer, deeper perspective, one that asks whether the cost of awareness is actually part of its value. Because without cost, there is no weight, and without weight, there is no significance. And maybe that is why the story continues to resonate, because it reflects a truth that is still unfolding. The truth that becoming aware is not easy, that understanding is not always comfortable, that growth often comes with tension, but it is through that process that something real is formed, something authentic, something that cannot exist without choice. And if you bring this back to your own life, you begin to see the pattern more clearly. The moments where you are faced with a decision that challenges your current understanding, the moments where you feel the pull between staying the same and becoming something different. And those moments are not accidents. They are part of the same process that began in that garden, the process of becoming aware, of becoming responsible, of becoming fully human. And this is where the story stops being about Eve and starts being about you. Because the same dynamic exists within you, the same tension, the same possibility, the same risk, and the question remains open, not as something that needs a quick answer, but as something that invites reflection. What do you do when you are faced with the opportunity to understand more, when you are standing at the edge of something that could change you? Do you step forward, or do you step back? Do you choose the comfort of what you already know, or the uncertainty of what you could discover? And maybe there is no universally correct answer. Maybe each choice carries its own consequences, its own lessons, its own path. But one thing remains clear, that the act of choosing itself is what defines the human experience. And that act began in that moment, in that decision, in that step beyond what was simply given. And perhaps that is why this story has never disappeared, because it captures something essential, something that cannot be reduced to a single interpretation, something that continues to live in every person who has ever asked a question, who has ever doubted, who has ever searched for something beyond what was handed to them. And maybe that is the real reason it has been told for so long, not to provide a final answer, but to keep the question alive. Because as long as the question remains, so does the possibility of understanding. And as long as that possibility exists, the story is not finished.